Elara was 26 years old when her grandmother died, and her inheritance, after the good china and the paid-off Ford pickup and the savings account were seized by relatives with harder faces and faster lawyers, amounted to a single, derided asset. It was a tax deed for 71 acres of scrubland the county itself had failed to sell 3 times, a forgotten parcel choked with thorn apple and kudzu, technically hers if she could pay the $1,428.57 in back taxes. Her Aunt Carol, counting the cash from the estate sale in crisp, satisfying snaps, had laughed. $1 for every thistle, she'd said, and pushed the folded paper across the lawyer's mahogany desk. Enjoy your kingdom of dirt. Carol couldn't know, nobody could, that buried beneath the thorns was a secret kept for 50 years, a forbidden work of patience and stone, waiting not for a buyer, but for an heir. But that comes later. First, there was the silence after the funeral. It wasn't a funeral so much as a gathering in the community hall, a place that smelled of stale coffee and floor wax. Maeve hadn't wanted a fuss, no church, no weeping pastor, just the quiet turning of a page. Elara sat on a folding metal chair in the back row, a ghost in her own family's story. Aunt Carol held court near the front, accepting condolences with a practiced dip of her head, her grief as tailored and tidy as her navy blue suit. Carol's husband, Uncle Robert, stood beside her, a soft, apologetic man who checked his watch every few minutes as if timing the propriety of their sorrow. Their son, Mark, a boy Elara had once built forts with in the woods behind Maeve's house, stood awkwardly by the door, his eyes darting everywhere but toward Elara. People from town drifted in and out, the old ones mostly, their faces etched with the kind of authentic sadness that made Carol's performance look garish. They didn't talk about Maeve's assets. They talked about her hands. They talked about the winter of '98, when she'd sat up all night with the Miller boy's colic, pressing warm compresses of chamomile and fennel to his belly until the fever broke. They talked about her preserves, the single jar of spiced pear she'd bring to any house that had known a recent loss, a small, sweet rebellion against bitterness. An old farmer named Jebediah gripped Elara's shoulder, his hand as rough as bark. "Your grandma," he said, his voice thick, "she knew the land, knew its moods. People like that, they ain't made anymore." He pressed something small and cool into her palm. He closed her fingers over it. "She'd want you to have this, carried it forever." Elara opened her hand. It was a stone, a geode the size of a pullet's egg, milky and unremarkable on its fractured, lumpy surface. Just a piece of the earth. After the last of the casseroles was covered in plastic wrap, and the last of the true mourners had drifted away, the reckoning began at the lawyer's office. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose kindness seemed to have been worn away by decades of parsing the greed of grieving families, read the will. It was simple, as Maeve had been simple. The house, the truck, the modest bank account, all to be divided equally between her 2 daughters, Carol and the memory of Lily, Elara's mother who had left 20 years ago and never come back. Since Lily was gone, her share, by law, fell to her only child. It should have been a 50-50 split, but Carol had paperwork. A loan document, signed by Maeve 5 years prior, for a new roof. A private loan from Carol herself, with a steep, compounding interest rate Elara had never heard about. Another for a well pump, another for medical bills. The papers were crisp, the signatures a little shaky, but legal. Utterly legal. By the time Mr. Abernathy had tallied the debts owed to Carol's side of the family, Maeve's entire liquid estate was consumed. The house was Carol's. The truck was Carol's. The $12,000 in savings were Carol's. "It's just business, Elara," Carol said, not unkindly, but with the finality of a banker closing a vault. "I loved Mama, but I'm not a charity. These were her debts." Elara said nothing. She just sat there, feeling the weight of the small, rough stone in her pocket. There was one last item. The 71 acres. a piece of land Maeve's own father had bought in the 40s, the back end of a much larger farm that had been sold off piece by piece. It was landlocked, accessible only by a crumbling right-of-way, and considered utterly worthless. The county had slapped liens on it for unpaid taxes years ago. "It's more of a liability than an asset, Mr. Abernathy advised gently. "The back taxes are, let's see." He shuffled papers. $1,428.57. If you pay that, the deed is clear. But frankly, honey, you'd be throwing good money after bad. Carol had waved a dismissive hand. Let her have it, a consolation prize. That was when she'd laughed. Enjoy your kingdom of dirt. The days that followed were a methodical erasure. Carol was efficient. An estate sale was scheduled for the weekend. Men in blue overalls came and tagged every object in Maeve's small, clean house. The rocking chair where Maeve had shelled peas, its arms worn smooth as river stones. Tagged. The cast iron skillet, black and heavy with a century of seasoning. Tagged. The shelf of canning jars, jewels of ruby raspberry and amber peach, gleaming in the afternoon light. Tagged and sold as a lot for $20 to a woman who would likely just use them for Pinterest crafts. Elara walked through the rooms, a visitor in her own memory. She saw not objects, but moments. The worn spot on the linoleum in front of the sink was where Maeve had stood every morning, humming, watching the finches at the feeder. The faint scent of lavender in the linen closet was the smell of every clean sheet she'd ever slept on. She tried to take a few small things. A chipped ceramic mug, a book of pressed flowers. Carol stopped her at the door. Everything is part of the estate, Elara. To settle the debts. It's the law. Her voice was firm, the voice of someone who had convinced herself she was the wronged party. Elara didn't argue. She packed a single duffel bag with her own clothes, the few things that had belonged to her before all this. As she was leaving, Jebediah's wife, Mary, stopped her on the porch. She pressed a shoebox into Elara's hands. It was full of sandwiches, a thermos of hot coffee, and a thick wool blanket. "A person's got to start somewhere," she said, her eyes full of a pity that felt more like respect. Elara had a little over $2,000 to her name, saved from 3 years of working at the town's only diner. Her car was a 15-year-old sedan that rattled on hills. She drove away from the house, from the town, from the life she had known, without looking back. She drove to the county records office. She stood at the counter, her hands steady, and wrote a check for $1,428.57. The clerk, a woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, stamped the deed with a heavy, satisfying thud. "It's all yours, honey," she said. "All 71 acres of it." The right-of-way was more a memory of a road than an actual one. 2 ruts, mostly overgrown, snaked away from the main county lane and disappeared into a wall of green. Elara parked her car where the gravel gave out, pulled her bag from the trunk, and started walking. The air grew thick and humid under the canopy of trees. Briars clutched at her jeans. The drone of insects was a constant, living sound. After a quarter mile, she came to a rusted gate hanging from a single hinge on a locust post. A faded, barely legible sign nailed to it read, "Trespassers will be." The rest had rotted away. This was it, her kingdom. She pushed through the gate and stood at the edge of her inheritance. It was worse than she'd imagined. A solid, impenetrable fortress of vegetation. Kudzu vines, thick as a man's wrist, smothered everything, draping over trees and creating monstrous, looming shapes in the dim light. Thornapple, blackberry brambles, and poison ivy grew in a dense, tangled understory. It was not a forest. It was a scar. A place the world had abandoned. For 3 days, she did nothing but walk the perimeter, or what she could guess was the perimeter, following a faint line of ancient rusted barbed wire half swallowed by the trees. She slept in her car, eating Mary's sandwiches and drinking the coffee cold. Despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest. Carol was right. This was worthless. A joke. She sat on the hood of her car on the third evening, watching the sunset, feeling the rough, cool surface of the geode in her pocket. What had Maeve been thinking, holding on to this place, paying taxes on it for decades, until she got too sick and too poor to continue? Maeve had always said, "The land remembers, you just got to be quiet enough to listen." Elara closed her eyes. What did this land remember? Neglect, thorns, silence. The idea came to her not as a flash of inspiration, but as a slow, creeping thought, a whisper from Maeve's own practicality. You don't fight a jungle with your hands. You fight it with hunger. The next morning, she drove the 40 miles to the nearest livestock auction. The place was a cacophony of smells and sounds, of manure and fear and the fast, rhythmic patter of the auctioneer. She watched for an hour, learning the flow, the nods, the subtle gestures. She didn't want a prize-winning herd. She wanted the outcasts, the stubborn ones, the ones with voracious, indiscriminate appetites. She bought a small lot of 14 goats, a motley crew of breeds and colors, for $600. They were thin and scraggly, but their eyes were bright and curious. The auctioneer threw in an old guard dog, a rangy Great Pyrenees mix with one blue eye and one brown, for free. "He's old, but he'll keep the coyotes honest," the man said. Getting them back to the property was a comedy of errors involving a rented trailer, a broken latch, and a goat chase down a 2-lane highway. But by nightfall, they were there. Elara used the last of her money to buy a few rolls of electric net fencing and a solar charger. She fenced off a small quarter-acre patch near the gate. The goats, after a moment of hesitation, lowered their heads and got to work. The sound was extraordinary, a constant, relentless munching, a tearing and grinding of leaves and stems and bark. It was the sound of reclamation. Elara named the dog Buck. She named the lead goat, a bossy nanny with intelligent yellow eyes, Juniper. The days fell into a rhythm. Each morning, Elara would move the fence, giving the goats a fresh section of jungle to devour. She bought a cheap tent and pitched it just inside the gate. Buck slept at the entrance, a silent, watchful guardian. The goats were magnificent eating machines. They devoured the poison ivy first, a delicacy to them. They stood on their hind legs to strip the kudzu from the lower branches of trees. They chewed the blackberry canes down to nubs. Slowly, painstakingly, yard by yard, the land began to reveal itself. Beneath the smothering green, there was a world, gentle, rolling hills. Stands of old-growth oak and hickory the kudzu hadn't yet managed to kill. A small, spring-fed creek that whispered through a gully. And stones. Everywhere, flat, gray limestone shale, layered like pages in a book. The goats worked for weeks, their bellies growing round, their coats sleek. Elara worked alongside them, cutting the thicker vines with a machete, pulling the stubborn roots. Her hands, once soft from diner work, became calloused and strong. She felt a connection to this place, a sense of purpose that pushed back the grief. She was tending Maeve's last garden. One hot afternoon in late August, she noticed Juniper behaving strangely. The other goats were grazing peacefully, but the lead nanny was standing near a massive, ancient oak tree at the crest of the property's highest hill. She wasn't eating. She was stamping a single forefoot and letting out a low, guttural bleat, her gaze fixed on the ground. Elara walked over, shooing her away gently. "What is it, girl?" The ground here was a tangle of ancient ivy roots, thick as snakes, woven around the base of the oak. But something was different. There was a strange linearity to the ground, a subtle, straight edge of stone almost completely hidden by the roots and dirt. It didn't look natural. Curiosity sparked. She fetched a shovel and a mattock from her tent. The work was brutal. The ivy roots were dense and woody, fighting her every inch. Buck came and lay in the shade of the oak, watching with his mismatched eyes. After an hour of chopping and digging, she had cleared a small patch. It was a lintel, a huge, single piece of cut stone, perfectly level, set into the hillside. Below it, as she cleared more dirt, she found the top of a door. A heavy, thick-planked door made of oak, bound with straps of rusted iron. In the center was a massive iron ring, a handle. Her heart hammered in her chest. A root cellar? It was common in this part of the country. But this was different. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The stones were fitted so perfectly, without a hint of mortar, that even after decades of neglect, they were unmovable. This wasn't a farmer's rough cellar. This was built by a master. It took her the rest of the day to clear the entrance. The door was swollen shut, held fast by years of damp and pressure. She used a long pry bar, leveraging it against the stone frame, putting all of her weight into it. The wood groaned, a deep, mournful sound from the belly of the earth. It resisted, held its ground. Then, with a sharp crack that echoed across the cleared hillside, it gave way. The door swung inward into darkness. A blast of air rolled out, cool and damp and alive. It was not the dead, musty smell of a forgotten cellar. It smelled of earth, of mushrooms, of stone, and something else. Something rich and nutty and faintly sharp. It was a smell of unimaginable patience. She stood at the threshold, her hands trembling, the setting sun at her back casting a long shadow into the opening. She retrieved a flashlight from her tent. With Buck at her heels, she took a deep breath and stepped across the threshold, out of the world of the sun and into the cool, silent dark. The beam of her flashlight cut through the blackness, revealing a space that made her gasp. It was not a cellar. It was a cave. A long, vaulted chamber that extended deep into the hillside. The walls were not dirt, but living stone, the same gray shale she had seen across the property, glistening with moisture. And lining the walls, from floor to ceiling, were shelves. Not wooden shelves, but shelves cut from the same flat limestone, supported by pillars of meticulously stacked rock. It was a work of art, a cathedral of stone and shadow. And the shelves were full. They held hundreds of wheels of cheese. They were arranged by size and shape, from small, puck-like discs to massive wheels that must have weighed 50 pounds. Each one was a different shade of ochre, amber, and pale cream, their rinds textured with molds of white, blue, and gray. They were beautiful, like geological specimens. Some were wrapped in what looked like leaves, others coated in a dark, waxy rind. Small hand-carved wooden tags hung from some of the shelves, the writing faded but still legible. Blue Ridge Blue, 1998. Hickory Smoked Tom, 2003. Goat's Milk Chev, Aged in Ash, 2007. This was Maeve's secret, a lifetime of work hidden in the earth. This wasn't just a hobby, this was mastery. An Athanage cave, a place for aging cheese, built with a knowledge of temperature, humidity, and airflow that was nothing short of genius. The constant cool air from some deeper vent, the moisture seeping through the limestone walls. It was a perfect, self-regulating environment. Elara walked deeper into the cave, the flashlight beam dancing over the silent, sleeping wheels. She touched one, a large, hard-rinded wheel on a low shelf. It was cool and solid as stone. How had she done this? Where did she get the milk? How did she build this place, by herself, without anyone knowing? The sheer scale of the labor, the decades of patience, was staggering. This was Maeve's love, expressed not in words, but in stone and milk and time. At the very back of the cave, on a high, altar-like shelf, sat a single, perfect-looking wheel of cheese, its rind a beautiful, mottled gold. Beside it was a small wooden box and a stack of what looked like books, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. Elara reached up and carefully brought them down. The box was heavy, made of cedar. She opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried herbs, was a set of cheesemaker's tools. A copper ladle, a long, slender curd knife, a thermometer. They were worn with use, the wooden handles polished smooth by Maeve's hands. She set the box aside and began to unwrap the books. They were journals. 5 of them, their leather covers stiff, their pages filled with Maeve's familiar, spidery script. She opened the first one. The date on the inside cover was 1971, the year Alara's mother was born. She sat down on the stone floor of the cave, the cool air raising goosebumps on her arms, the smell of aging cheese all around her. Buck lay down beside her, his head on his paws. With the beam of the flashlight illuminating the page, she began to read. The first journal was a record of building. It detailed in painstaking entries the construction of the cave. Maeve had not built it alone. Her husband, Alara's grandfather, a man who had died long before she was born, had been a stonemason. Together, they had spent 3 years digging into the hillside, shoring it up with stone, finding the natural vent that made the cave breathe. It was to be their secret, their legacy. A place to store what is real, Maeve had written. Not money in a bank, but food from the earth. Something no one can take from you. Then, after his sudden death from a heart attack, the entries stopped for a year. When they resumed, the tone was different, sharper, more determined. Maeve began to teach herself the art of cheesemaking. The journals were part science textbook, part diary. There were detailed notes on milk temperatures, cultures, rennet settings, salting techniques. There were sketches of curd knives and cheese presses she built herself. She documented her failures, a batch of Tom that turned bitter, a brie that collapsed, with the same methodical detail as her successes. She wrote about her sources. She had made arrangements with a dozen small family farms in the surrounding counties, buying their excess milk, the best milk, from goat, sheep, and cow. She drove the winding back roads in the dead of night, in her old pickup, collecting the milk in stainless steel cans. No one knew what she was doing. They thought she was just a strange woman who liked to drive at night. She was a ghost, building a secret kingdom. And then, woven into the technical notes, the philosophy began to emerge. Alara found the phrase for the first time on a page dated 1982, underlined twice. Good things take their own slow time. You can't hurry the curd, and you can't hurry the truth. It was a refrain, appearing again and again over the years. It was Maeve's creed. Alara read for hours, until the flashlight grew dim. She went back to her tent, replaced the batteries, and returned. She read through the night, the story of Maeve's life unfolding in a way she had never known. The journals were full of joy, the quiet satisfaction of a craft mastered. And they were full of sorrow. She read about Alara's mother, Lily, a wild, bright girl who loved the farm, but chafed at its isolation. She read about the arguments, the growing distance between a mother who was rooted in the earth and a daughter who longed for the horizon. She thinks this is a prison, Maeve wrote, the ink slightly blurred as if by a tear. She doesn't see it as a sanctuary. The later journals grew more sporadic. The entries were shorter, the handwriting more cramped. Maeve wrote about her aging body, the ache in her joints that made carrying the heavy wheels of cheese a trial. She wrote about her dwindling savings, about having to choose between paying the taxes on the land and buying the medicine she needed. She never wrote a word of complaint. It was just a simple accounting of facts. In the last journal, tucked into a pocket in the back cover, Alara found a letter, written in a shaky hand. It was addressed to her. My dearest Alara, if you are reading this, then you found my secret. I hope you found it with the goats. They are the only ones honest enough to clear a path. This place, this cave, this is the real inheritance. Not the house, not the money, those things can be taken. But the knowledge, the work of your hands, that is yours forever. I am sorry for what Carol will do. I know her heart. It is small and frightened, and it measures everything in dollars. Do not let her bitterness poison you. There is more to this land than cheese. There is a story buried here, a wrong that I was not strong enough to set right. The truth is in this last journal. What you do with it is your choice. Remember what I taught you. Good things take their own slow time. You can't hurry the curd, and you can't hurry the truth. But eventually, the truth must be faced. All my love, Grandma Maeve. Alara's hands were shaking as she turned to the last entries in the final journal. They were no longer about cheese, they were about history. Maeve had spent years at the county courthouse, in the dusty archives, researching the original deeds to the land. She had pieced together a story of quiet, legal theft. The Thorne family, who now owned the sprawling, prosperous Thornhill farms that bordered their property, had not come by their land honestly. Their great-grandfather, Elias Thorne, had been a wealthy land speculator in the 1930s. Ilara's great-great-grandfather, a poor farmer named Samuel, had owned the entire 300-acre parcel. During the Depression, Thorne had used a crooked surveyor and a falsified deed to lay claim to the front 230 acres, the part with the rich bottomland and the river access. He had left Samuel with the rocky, inaccessible 71 acres at the back. It was a classic case of the rich preying on the poor, a story as old as the hills themselves. Samuel had tried to fight it, but he had no money for lawyers. The Thornes had won. Maeve had found the proof. Tucked between the pages of the journal was a fragile, yellowed piece of paper. It was a tracing of the original 1888 survey map, showing the property lines clearly. And she had found something more, a sworn affidavit from the surveyor's son, written on his deathbed in 1975, confessing his father's crime. He had sent it to Maeve anonymously, a conscience-stricken ghost reaching out from the past. But Maeve had done nothing. The last entry explained why. It was about Lily. When Lily was 18, she had found Maeve's research. She had been furious, full of righteous fire. She wanted to expose the Thornes, to sue them, to reclaim their family's name. Maeve, weary from a lifetime of quiet struggle, had refused. She was afraid. Afraid of the Thornes' power, their lawyers, their influence in the county. She just wanted to be left alone to make her cheese and tend her secret. The fight had been the final, breaking chasm between them. She called me a coward, Maeve wrote. And she was right. I let her go. I let her walk away because I was afraid. It is the one regret of my life. Lily had left, and 2 weeks later had sent a single postcard from California. She had never been heard from again. Ilara sat in the silence of the cave, the weight of 100 years of history settling on her. This land was not just a worthless parcel. It was a crime scene. And this cave was not just a cheese cellar. It was a monument to a lifetime of defiant, silent protest. The next morning, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was an old man, wiry and weathered, with a gentle, hesitant smile. It was Arlo, a neighbor who lived a few miles down the road, a man who had known Maeve for 60 years. He carried a covered basket. "Figured you might be out here," he said, his voice a soft, rural drawl. "Saw the smoke from your campfire. Mary sent some biscuits." Ilara, wary of everyone after the betrayal of her aunt, just nodded. Arlo's eyes scanned the clearing, the neat work of the goats, and then settled on the dark opening in the hillside. He didn't look surprised. He just nodded slowly. "So you found it," he said. "Always wondered what she was really doing in there." She called it her root cellar. But the smells. Sometimes on a damp evening, you could catch a scent on the wind. Smelled like nothing else on earth. He peered into the darkness. Lord have mercy. All this time. He didn't ask to go inside. He respected the threshold. He sat with Ilara on an old log, and they shared the biscuits. He told her stories about her grandmother, about the nights he'd see the dim headlights of her truck coming up the hollow long after midnight. "People thought she was odd," he said. "I just thought she was busy, had a purpose." Ilara, feeling a sudden need to trust someone, told him. She told him about the cheese, about the journals, about the Thornes. Arlo listened, his face impassive, but his eyes hardening as she spoke. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. "I remember the stories," he said finally. "My own grandfather used to talk about it. Said Old Man Thorne stole that land slick as a whistle. But it was just talk. Barbershop talk. No one ever had proof. He looked at Alara, his gaze steady. Your grandmother was a good woman. But she carried a heavy load. This was too heavy for her to carry alone. He stood up, brushing the crumbs from his pants. You're not alone, girl, he said. And then he walked back down the hill. 2 days later, the sound of a powerful engine rumbled up the right-of-way. A gleaming new black pickup truck, the kind that had never known a day of real work, pulled up to the gate. A man in a crisp polo shirt and expensive jeans got out. He was tall and confident, with the easy smile of a man used to getting his way. Ma'am, he said, leaning on the gate. Silas Thorne. My property borders this one. Alara's blood ran cold. She stood up from the log she was mending, her hands tightening on the hammer. Buck rose beside her, a low growl rumbling in his chest. I heard the county finally unloaded this piece of mess, Thorne said, his eyes scanning the cleared land with a dismissive air. Frankly, I'm surprised anyone was foolish enough to take it. He gave her a condescending smile. Look, I'll get right to it. I'm planning a new development on my eastern pasture. A series of high-end cabin rentals. This plot of yours is useless for building, but it would make a perfect secondary access road. I'm prepared to offer you $5,000 for it. Cash. Take it off your hands, save you the trouble. $5,000. For a lifetime of work. For a family's stolen history. Alara felt a strange calm settle over her. She looked at this man, at his clean hands and his confident smirk, and she felt not fear, but a cold, clear anger. She said nothing. She just looked at him. He chuckled, misinterpreting her silence. That's a generous offer. More than it's worth. I'm just trying to be a good neighbor. The original survey of this property, Alara said, her voice quiet but carrying in the still air. The one from 1888. Do you know where the eastern boundary line on that map was? Thorne's smile faltered. A flicker of confusion, then annoyance, crossed his face. What are you talking about? The line is where the fence is, always has been. Are you sure about that? She asked. It was a simple, factual question, but it landed with the force of an accusation. She saw it in his eyes. He knew. He must have heard the same barbershop talk Arlo had. He just never expected to be confronted with it, especially not by a quiet girl in dirty jeans on a piece of worthless land. He recovered quickly, his face hardening. I don't have time for games. The offer is $5,000. It expires in 24 hours. He got back in his truck, spun the tires in the dirt, and roared away. Alara stood watching the dust settle, her heart pounding. The fight was here. It had come to her. She could take the money and walk away, just as her grandmother had chosen to do. Or she could stay and fight, as her mother had wanted to. And this is where the story turns. You might think you know how it ends, with the small holding out against the great. But the truth, like the cheese, is more complicated. The part worth waiting for isn't the victory, it's the reckoning. That night, Alara sat in the cave, the journals open in her lap. She read Maeve's letter to her again, the words of a woman confessing her one great failure of nerve. She called me a coward, and she was right. Alara looked around at the silent, sleeping wheels of cheese. They were the product of immense courage, of a quiet, stubborn refusal to be broken. Maeve had not been a coward in her work, only in this one fight. And she had left the weapons for Alara. She picked up the geode from the stone shelf where she'd placed it. She ran her thumb over its rough, unassuming exterior. Then she turned it over, to the broken face where the crystals glittered in the lantern light. Plain on the outside, a secret beauty within. It was the story of this land. It was the story of her grandmother. It was her story now. She made her decision. The next morning, she drove into town. Not to the courthouse, not to a lawyer's office. She went to the payphone outside the general store. Her first call was to the State Department of Agriculture. She asked to speak to an inspector, someone who specialized in dairy and artisan food production. Her second call was to the County Historical Society. She told them she had some documents they might find interesting. She was done being silent. A week later, a sensible sedan with a state government seal on the door made its way carefully up the rutted track. A woman in her 50s, with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense haircut, got out. Her name was Diane Albright. She was a legend in the state's small farming community, a fierce advocate for artisan producers. Alara led her to the cave. Ms. Albright stood at the entrance, her professional composure momentarily cracking. She breathed in the complex aroma. "Oh my," she whispered. She walked inside, her eyes wide with wonder. She spent 2 hours in the cave, examining the cheeses, tapping the rinds, studying the construction of the cave itself. She looked at Maeve's journals, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she emerged, her face was a mask of awe and fury. "Do you know what this is?" she said to Alara. "This is a cultural treasure. The work in these journals. It's a masterclass. And these cheeses, aged for 10, 15, 20 years? Properly? This is unheard of. This is priceless." She looked at Alara, her eyes sharp. "This place needs to be protected. Officially. What do you need?" "Silas Thorne wants to bulldoze it for an access road," Alara said simply. Ms. Albright's jaw tightened. "Not on my watch." The county board meeting was held in the same community hall where Maeve's memorial had taken place. It was packed. Silas Thorne was there, sitting in the front row with his lawyer, looking confident. He was on the agenda to get a zoning variance for his luxury cabin development. Alara had been added to the agenda at the last minute, under the heading Public Comment. Aunt Carol was there, drawn by the local gossip. She saw Alara sitting in the back and gave her a look of mingled pity and contempt. The whole town seemed to be there, curious to see the quiet girl who was rumored to be squatting on the old, worthless plot make a fool of herself. Thorne's presentation was slick and professional, full of architectural renderings and promises of tax revenue and jobs. The board, made up of local businessmen, nodded along, already sold. When he was finished, the board chairman, a florid man named Henderson, said, "Thank you, Silas. A fine project." He glanced at his agenda. "Next, we have Alara Vance." A murmur went through the crowd. Alara walked to the front, her hands steady. She carried a simple cardboard box. She didn't stand at the podium. She stood in the center of the room, on the floor, so she could look everyone in the eye. "My name is Alara Vance," she began, her voice clear and low. "My grandmother, Maeve Vance, left me the 71 acres that border Mr. Thorne's property on the west." Thorne smirked. Carol rolled her eyes. "For 50 years, Alara continued, my grandmother was a master cheesemaker. She built a facility on that land. A natural cave for the aging of artisan cheese. It is a place of unique agricultural and historical significance." She paused. On cue, the door opened and Diane Albright walked in. She introduced herself and her credentials. In calm, irrefutable terms, she described the cave, the quality of the cheese, and the irreplaceable nature of Maeve's work. She submitted a preliminary report recommending the site for inclusion on the state's register of protected agricultural landmarks. The board members stopped nodding. They started listening. Then Alara spoke again. "But the value of this land isn't just in the cheese. It's in its history." She reached into her box and pulled out the yellowed, fragile tracing of the 1888 survey map. She walked over to the large county map hanging on the wall. With trembling hands, she taped the old map over the new one. The discrepancy was stark, obvious. A huge swath of the Thornhill Farms, the most valuable part, was clearly shown as belonging to her family's original parcel. "This is the original survey," she said. "And this," she held up a document in a plastic sleeve, is a deathbed confession from the son of the surveyor who created the fraudulent map in 1934 that gave the Thorne family my family's land. A collective gasp went through the room. Silas Thorne jumped to his feet, his face purple with rage. This is slander. This is absurd. Ilara ignored him. She held up one of Maeve's journals. My grandmother spent years documenting this. She was afraid to come forward. She was afraid of men like Mr. Thorne. She looked directly at the board. His development project isn't just about cabins. It's about erasing a history he doesn't want known. His access road would go right through the heart of my grandmother's life's work, and right over the scene of his family's crime. The room was utterly silent. The people who had laughed at her, who had dismissed her, were now looking at her with a new expression. Respect. Ilara wasn't finished. This isn't just about my family, she said, her voice gaining strength. She opened the journal. Maeve made a list of the other families in this county who lost their land to Elias Thorne in the same way during the Depression. The Millers, the Sullivans, the Pattersons, the Garcias. She read the names, one by one, like a prayer. With each name, someone in the crowd flinched, a son or a granddaughter, recognizing their own family's whispered stories of loss. She had not just revealed a private wrong, she had excavated the town's buried history of injustice. When she was done, the silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a truth finally spoken aloud. The board chairman, Henderson, cleared his throat. He looked at Thorne, then at Ilara, then at the faces in the crowd. Mr. Thorne, he said, his voice suddenly heavy, I believe we'll need to table your request for a variance pending a thorough review of these historical documents by the county attorney. Thorne didn't say a word. He grabbed his briefcase and stormed out of the hall, his lawyer scurrying behind him. The spell was broken. The room erupted in a low buzz of conversation. Aunt Carol was pale, her mouth a tight, thin line. She looked at Ilara, truly seeing her for the first time, and in her eyes was not anger, but a dawning, horrified understanding. She had thrown away a treasure. She had laughed at a legacy. In the aftermath, Silas Thorne's world unraveled. His development project collapsed as investors pulled out, spooked by the clouds over his land titles. The county, forced by public pressure and the unassailable evidence, opened an official inquiry. Thorne was not humbled by grace, but by the cold, hard mechanics of consequence. He was ruined by a truth he thought had been safely buried for nearly a century. A few days after the meeting, as Ilara was watering the small garden she had planted near her tent, a dusty, beat-up sedan pulled into the clearing. Her cousin, Mark, got out. He looked thinner, his face drawn. He stood for a moment, shifting his weight, unable to meet her eyes. My mom, he started, then stopped. She was wrong. About everything. He finally looked at her, his eyes full of a shame so profound it was almost a physical presence. I stood by. I let it happen. I didn't say anything. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just looked at the broken section of fence the goats had been testing. What needs fixing? He asked. It was the beginning. He started showing up every weekend. He didn't talk much. He worked. He helped her build a small, clean milking parlor. He repaired the fences. He learned the goats' names. It was a slow, quiet penance, a rebuilding of trust through shared labor, not words. One day, he brought a peace offering. It was Maeve's cast-iron skillet. He'd bought it back from the woman at the estate sale. He just set it on her camp stove without a word. It was enough. The seasons turned. With help from a grant secured by Ms. Albright, Ilara built a small, state-certified creamery next to the cave. She began to make cheese, following Maeve's recipes, her hands moving with an inherited grace. She started small, selling at the local farmers market. The story of the cave, of Maeve's secret, had become a local legend. People didn't just buy her cheese, they bought a piece of the story. They bought it with a reverence for the slow, honest work it represented. Arlo's granddaughter, a bright 10-year-old named Sarah, started spending her afternoons with Alara, her fascination with the goats blossoming into a genuine interest in the craft. Alara taught her how to milk, how to test the temperature, how to cut the curd. She was passing it on, just as Maeve had passed it to her through the journals. The legacy was not a static thing to be protected. It was a living craft, breathing and growing in a new generation's hands. One afternoon, while cleaning out the cedar box that held Maeve's tools, Alara found a false bottom. Beneath it lay a single, folded envelope, brittle with age. It was a letter to Maeve from her daughter Lily, sent a year after she had left. It wasn't angry. It was heartbroken. It spoke of her regret, of her longing for the hills, of a new life started in a new place. And at the bottom, there was a return address in a small town in Oregon. Maeve had never opened it. Or perhaps she had, and the pain was too much, so she had hidden it away, a wound she couldn't bear to look at. The failure of nerve had not just been about the land, it had been about love, too. Alara held the letter, a map to the missing piece of her life. The anger she had held for her absent mother softened into a deep, aching understanding. They were all just people, flawed and afraid, doing the best they could with the burdens they carried. The cheese cave had given her back her grandmother. Now this letter might give her back her mother. She would write. Not today, but soon. Some things needed their own slow time. The sun was rising, painting the eastern sky in shades of pale rose and gold. Alara stood at the entrance to the cave, the cool, earthy air washing over her. The goats were stirring, their bells clanking softly in the morning quiet. In the east, the vast rolling hills of the Thorne property, now tied up in legal battles that would likely outlast Silas himself, were shrouded in mist. But here, on her 71 acres, the air was clear. She held the small geode in her hand, its rough exterior warm from her skin, the hidden crystals catching the first light of day. She could almost hear Maeve's voice, a whisper on the morning breeze, a creed for the life she had built from the ruins. Good things take their own slow time. You can't hurry the curd, and you can't hurry the truth. She smiled, a real, bone-deep smile of peace, and walked out into the light to begin her day's work.